Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us today, because honestly, we're about to unpack one of the absolute most remarkable historical transformations of all time. I want you to just set the scene in your mind for a second. We're going back 2,000 years. A carpenter from a dusty, mostly forgotten corner of the massive Roman Empire is executed as a state criminal. He leaves behind no army, no palace, no written book. Actually, all he leaves behind are 12 incredibly frightened followers, basically hiding out in the shadows of Jerusalem.
And that brings us to the core historical question for today. How on earth did an illegal, heavily persecuted sect become history's largest institution? Seriously, how do we get from terrified people holding secret, whispered meetings in underground tombs to incredibly powerful leaders making world-altering decisions in smoke-filled councils? Well, we are going to trace exactly how early Christianity transformed from a tiny outcast movement into the Roman Catholic Church.
And just to really highlight the stakes of what we're discussing today, think about this number, 1.3 billion. That is the current global membership of the Catholic Church right now. We're talking about an institution that has crowned kings, literally toppled empires, and fundamentally shaped Western civilization. But to truly grasp how any movement ends up commanding over 1 billion followers, we have to jump back 2 millennia to uncover its incredibly fragile origins.
Let's start with Section 1, an unlikely first century.
To really understand the beginning, we have to look at the world this movement was actually born into. First century Judea was a Roman province, and it was tense. It was heavily taxed, tightly controlled, and essentially a political pressure cooker filled with religious expectations and simmering rebellion. It's right into this incredibly tense atmosphere that a preacher named Jesus of Nazareth appears, gathers some followers, and is executed by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate around 30 to 33 AD. But following his crucifixion, his followers made a huge claim. They claimed he rose from the dead. And look, whatever you personally believe about that claim, historians all agree that the specific belief totally transformed a terrified group into a bold movement, a movement of people literally willing to die for their faith. This foundational shift is brilliantly captured in a single quote from the Gospel of Matthew. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That one line became the entire theological foundation for the papacy. It basically established the idea that Simon Peter, and whoever succeeded him, held a unique, divinely appointed authority.
Now, during this early period, two wildly different vital figures emerged. On one side, you have Peter, acting as the institutional anchor and the leader back in Jerusalem. And on the other side, you have Paul of Tarsus. And Paul's story is literally like a movie script. He goes from being a zealous, violent persecutor of early Christians to having this blinding vision that completely flips him into the movement's greatest traveling missionary. So while Peter anchored the community at home, Paul was the guy out there fiercely arguing that this faith needed to spread way beyond Judaism.
And that push from Paul led to arguably the most important decision in the movement's early history. Around 49 AD, at the Council of Jerusalem, they made the call to open the faith to non-Jews, and they didn't require them to follow Jewish dietary laws or customs first. This embedded a radical new concept right into their core identity, Catholicos. It's a Greek word that means universal. Without this massive shift toward universalism, this group almost certainly would have just remained a tiny, forgotten historical footnote. Instead, they threw their doors wide open to the world.
Which takes us to Section 2, Surviving the Roman Empire.
Spreading the word was one thing, sure, but just surviving the next 3 centuries was a totally different beast. You see, Rome was generally pretty tolerant of foreign religions, but they had one major, non-negotiable rule. You had to honor the Roman gods and worship the emperor. And Christians, they categorically refused. To the Romans, this wasn't just some quaint difference of religious opinion. It was an act of political treason. Because of this defiance, early Christians became the ultimate scapegoats. Whenever there was a natural disaster or social unrest, they took the blame. Under emperors like Nero and Diocletian, the waves of persecution were absolutely brutal. In fact, tradition holds that both Peter and Paul were martyred during these purges. Everyday believers were forced to go totally off the grid, holding their worship secretly in the underground catacombs beneath Rome just to stay alive.
When you are living in constant fear of execution, you have to get incredibly creative. And they did. They adopted the ichthys, which you probably know as the famous secret fish symbol. Early believers cleverly used this to safely identify each other while hiding in the shadows of the empire. It's actually a hidden code. The Greek letters for the word fish doubled as a secret acronym that spelled out Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. It was a brilliant survival mechanism, operating right under the Romans' noses.
But here is the crazy part. How does a group facing such terrifying, constant threat of execution actually manage to grow? Well, sociologists point to 2 main things. First, radical inclusivity. Unlike traditional Roman society, they eagerly welcomed women, the poor, and slaves into their ranks. It was for everyone. Second, extreme social care. During these horrific plagues where even family members were fleeing the cities, Christians were the ones staying behind to tend to the sick. That intense devotion and tight-knit community network actually caused this underground movement to expand incredibly fast.
And that sets the stage for Section 3, the emperor changes everything.
While the early church's survival absolutely relied on the grassroots dedication of its followers, its shift into a sprawling global institution relied on a massive historical curveball in the early 4th century. It all centers around a Roman general named Constantine. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Constantine is marching to fight for total control of the Roman Empire. Christian tradition says that he had a vision of a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by a very specific command, "In this sign conquer." So he ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shields, and he went on to win the battle decisively.
The speed of what happens next is just dizzying. Let's look at the timeline. In 312 AD, we have the vision. Literally 1 year later, in 313, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which officially legalizes Christianity. By 325, he's convening a massive church council. And by 380 AD, less than 70 years after they were literally being hunted down in the streets, Christianity becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Talk about a reversal of fortune. Almost overnight, an outlawed underground sect was holding the keys to the entire empire.
So what happens when you suddenly get all that power? That brings us to Section 4, defining the Catholic doctrine. Because as you can imagine, this newfound imperial backing brought a massive new headache. What exactly were Christians supposed to believe? Up until this point, remember, they were just a loose underground network. They certainly didn't agree on everything. But suddenly they needed one unified voice. And the most explosive theological clash threatened to just completely fracture the newly legalized religion right out of the gate. On one side, you had Arius, a priest teaching that Jesus was a created being and therefore not fully equal to God. Opposing him was Athanasius, who insisted Jesus was fully divine and of one exact substance with God. Now, Constantine needed a unified empire, and there was no way he was going to let a theological debate tear it apart.
So, Constantine takes action. In 325 AD, he gathers roughly 300 bishops at the Council of Nicaea. They debated, and they ultimately produced the Nicene Creed, which firmly declared Jesus as fully divine. But the really crucial takeaway here isn't just the theology, it's that this council marked the true birth of the institutional church structure. For the first time, you have a centralized, unified church capable of defining official belief, and crucially, it is now backed by the full might of the Roman emperor.
But as history shows us time and again, empires don't last forever. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire completely collapses under the weight of barbarian invasions and economic ruin. Yet, as the traditional imperial authority crumbled away, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, stepped directly into the administrative power vacuum. Leaders like Pope Leo the Great suddenly found themselves negotiating with invading armies, organizing food supplies, and preserving the law. The Church didn't just survive the fall of Rome, it basically inherited Rome's cultural and administrative infrastructure.
Moving on to Section 5, the Great Schism.
Even as the Church grew in power, for centuries, a quiet but intense tension had been building between the two halves of the Christian world, the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. By this point, the drift was becoming undeniable. The Western Church was centered in Rome, they spoke Latin, and they firmly believed the Pope held supreme authority over all Christians everywhere. Meanwhile, the Eastern Church was centered in Constantinople, spoke Greek, and deferred to the authority of their patriarchs. Add in deep cultural and political conflicts, plus intense theological debates, like the infamous Filioque controversy regarding the Holy Trinity, and you have a recipe for disaster.
All of those simmering tensions finally boiled over in the year 1054 AD. This is an absolutely monumental year in history. In 1054, papal representatives from the West and the Patriarch in the East actually excommunicated each other. Think about that. This mutual rejection permanently, irreversibly split the Christian world into two distinct branches, the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East.
That 1054 schism is the exact moment the term Roman Catholic takes on the highly specific institutional meaning that we recognize today. It completely finalized this distinct, centralized church headquartered in Rome and focused entirely around papal authority. The incredibly long evolution from a scattered first-century Jewish sect to a distinct imperial institution was fully complete.
Okay, before we wrap up this explainer, let's quickly debunk a few common historical myths based on the expert consensus. First up, Constantine didn't invent Catholic doctrine at Nicaea out of thin air. He formalized beliefs that were already widely held in order to enforce political unity. Second, the early church was never this pure, perfectly unified monolith right out of the gate. That unity was aggressively negotiated, debated, and built over centuries. And third, historically speaking, Catholic and Christian are not interchangeable terms. Catholicism is a very specific institutional branch that evolved over 1,000 years of intense political and theological history.
So boiling it all down, why did this specific movement succeed over all its ancient rivals to shape the world? It really comes down to three structural factors. First, its rigid organizational structure gave it incredible resilience even when Rome fell. Second, its radical universalism made it accessible to anyone across a massive, multicultural empire. And third, honestly, sheer historical contingency. If Constantine hadn't seen that vision, or if the Western Empire hadn't collapsed exactly the way it did, this whole trajectory could look incredibly different.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on. Considering its incredibly fragile start as a persecuted sect, literally hiding out in underground tombs, is the survival and dominance of the Catholic Church history's greatest political accident, or is it something else entirely? History rarely moves in straight lines, you know? And the complex fusion of faith, power, and politics that we've explored today is still shaping the very world we live in right now. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me today to unpack this amazing piece of history.